problems. And so this is all about politics in that broader sense. And so that's where we want to dive in. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to the panelists and kick us off. Nitzan, I'm going to start with you. What were you thinking, and what did you think when you heard that Donald Trump was suspending funding to the WHO? Were you surprised, and what was your first thought?
Hi, Matthew. First of all, I want to thank you and Prerna and Kim for organizing this discussion. It's a great pleasure to be part of this. And I also wanted to thank the O'Neill Institute and the Watson Institute and the Monkey Cage for sponsoring this and supporting this. So in regard to the surprise and in regard to Trump's decision to freeze the funding to the WHO, I think a historical perspective is quite important here because, first of all, we know that President Trump does not trust multilateral institutions, does not trust multilateral treaties, and he has pulled out of many other organizations and treaties, such as the Paris Agreement, of course, the UN Human Rights Council and UNESCO. So it's in path or in line with Trump's previous behavior. But it's also important for us to know that this is precedented. He's not the only president who's done that before. So in the case of UNESCO, for example, he pulled out of UNESCO, but the US withdrew from UNESCO also between 1984 and 2002. US administration refused to pay UNESCO funds in 2011 and so on. So he's not alone. He's also not alone in American history in mixing together substantive complaints about the organization combined with geopolitical strategies and manipulations, right? So, for example, very often American presidents are punishing international organizations, for example, for supporting Palestinian causes. That's one common example. So in that regard, President Trump's action is not unprecedented. Maybe it's not surprising, but it is unique. And there are two ways by which it is unique that I will briefly mention. First of all, and quite obviously, he is threatening to freeze the funding of an international health organization in the middle of a pandemic crisis. This is unprecedented, right? Now, at the same time, thinking about the WHO as a political organization, we have to remember that he didn't decide to pull out of the WHO only to threaten to freeze the funding. So in that regard, we have to think about it maybe more as bargaining leverage than wanting to destroy the WHO. Secondly, and I think this is quite important, as I said, Trump is not the only one who likes to mix geopolitical concerns with substantive considerations in regard to participation in international organization, but the target of the geopolitical consideration is quite new, which is China, obviously. Now, I would like to suggest that one of the reasons that we are all so fascinated by the announcement by Trump is not so much because we are fascinated by the relationship between the US and the WHO, or not only because of that, but also because we are fascinated by the relationship between China and the WHO. And we kind of wonder whether Trump's response is not in some way an indication that China has become a real influencer at the multilateral level, and therefore, for some of us, a real concern. So it's the triangle between the WHO, US, and China that is really interesting and new here.
Great, and we're gonna dive, not surprisingly, into that shortly. Jeremy, over to you. What was your first thought as you heard that the president was going to try to freeze WHO funding? Were you surprised?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that each of the budgets that President Trump has proposed, he has proposed significant and major cuts to global health resources. So the United States is the largest funder for development assistance for health and has been for years and years and years. And in his past budgets, he's looked at cutting funding for things like the World Health Organization, like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, like for the Global Health Security Agenda, and for the international activities that are facilitated through the CDC and these sorts of organizations. And it's been Congress that has restored this funding and made sure that the United States has kept up its funding at the levels that it has. And so in one respect, this wasn't really a big surprise. This is something that he has signaled he's wanted to do for a long time. But as Nitsam correctly points out, now we're doing this in the midst of a time when there is more and more attention being paid to the World Health Organization, when the role of the World Health Organization is becoming even more crucial for the international community. And not even just for what happens with COVID-19, but as we're already starting to see, this is having broad effects on what the World Health Organization does writ large. So we've already seen warnings about how this is going to lead to significant decreases in the number of countries that are able to provide vaccinations for children. And we're already seeing increases in polio rates in some countries, precisely because these sorts of activities have to be interrupted because of everything else that's going on with COVID-19. So it's that timing issue, and I think as both of you have pointed out, a lot of it does get down to some of these larger geopolitical issues, and a lot of it does come down to the fact that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot at a time when an organization really needs to be at its strongest, or needs to be at its most resilient and most able to contribute to the international community. It's being hobbled and is having to devote this time and attention to dealing with these sorts of geopolitical concerns, as opposed to thinking about what do we need to do to not only deal with COVID-19, but to deal with a broad array of global health issues that it's supposed to deal with.
Thanks, Jeremy. So, the WHO has been in the headlines under critique by U.S. politicians, but also under critique kind of more softly from a number of different U.S. allies. I think those of us who deal with the WHO every day, can kind of be easy to forget how unique of an organization it is, and the many storms that it has had to weather up until now. This may turn out to be the biggest storm. We'll see. But can you just remind us, coming back a little bit, WHO came under tremendous criticism for its handling of the 2014 Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And so subsequently, the states passed a number of different reforms. Can you remind us about some of those changes? Do you think those changes have helped? Are we seeing the same problems at WHO under COVID-14, or are we really seeing the legacy of shifts that did happen post Ebola?
Yeah, I mean, in the aftermath of Ebola, we saw a number of proposals and a number of actual more substantive changes. So, there were things like the creation of this Health Emergencies Fund, where we could have some money, so the WHO could have some money just at the ready. So when an emergency did happen, it could at least provide some seed funding while it went out and raised additional funds for other sorts of programs. That does exist, but on the downside, that's only being funded through voluntary contributions from member states and from organizations. So it was already significantly underfunded and has come for a lot of requests up to this point. So it's there. It's a good idea, but it's nowhere near as effective as it could be, because it's been sidelined in some respects. We've also seen some other organizational changes. Tedros, the Director General, has changed how he has organized his cabinet. He's tried to make sure that it's a more representative body in terms of it having leadership from the different regions of the world, having a cabinet that is majority female, and trying to create more of a strategic policy dialogue, and trying to increase the mobility that staffers have between country offices, regional offices, and WHO headquarters, on the sense that this would give people a broader perspective. They have a better sense of what the WHO does as an overall organization. And some of those reforms have some promise, but it's too early to tell how much that they've actually had an effect. These are things that have been in effect now for maybe a year or two. And so it's hard to see how much of a change they've really had. But it also, none of these reforms get to some of the underlying structural weaknesses that an organization like the World Health Organization faces. In addition to having a fairly small budget, it's incredibly constrained in how much control it has over that budget. So somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80% of its budget is dictated by these voluntary contributions that are coming from a few donor states and from organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's great that they give those funds. It's great that the World Health Organization can carry out those missions, but it also means that the WHO can't really control its mission in a lot of respects. And so you've got an organization which is answerable to 194 different member states, plus organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and other major donors. And the organization itself doesn't have a lot of agency. It doesn't have a lot of ability to actually determine its own priorities and then fund those priorities. You know, even in the lead up to Ebola, before that outbreak took place, the WHO had to make significant cuts in its pandemic preparedness programs because of its own budgetary shortfalls. And so I think we're seeing some of these same sorts of issues return time and time again about the organization's actual structural autonomy and its budgetary authority in order to properly fund the sorts of contributions that it needs to carry out its mission.
Thanks, and I think that this is an incredibly important point that you're bringing up about kind of the structure of the WHO. I mean, I think one of the things that's from colleagues that I talk to, et cetera, you know, the emergency program really has gotten a lot of credit for acting in a very different way than what happened under Ebola, and to really having both an on-the-ground presence and a real ability to coordinate in ways that are actually quite impressive. But of course, there are real constraints there, right? This did not somehow become an agency that that is fully funded. It didn't become an agency that's able to really move more quickly. And so I think there's a really interesting set of reality checks that are necessary for especially folks who have not been deep into the World Health Organization to understand how effective this small little organization that's, you know, smaller than a lot of our tertiary hospitals in the United States, right? You know, a small organization that's meant to cover the world at the same time is got to respond to 194 countries. Anyway, it's a very interesting thing, and we'll continue to talk about that as we go. On which I want to shift to Nitzan for a moment. So in your book, you kind of write about how the Secretariat's often caught between these competing pressures from different sets of member states, right? And so you say that the agency employs a number of different strategies to deal with those. Can you talk about what have those strategies been over time? And how does that link to what we're seeing right now? And do you see the similar strategies, or have they really shifted?
Thank you. It's a direct follow-up from what Jeremy and you were talking about. So this is, the WHO is the UN specialized agencies, and like other UN specialized agencies, it has a bureaucracy. It's quite a small organization, and it's a member-driven organization. That is, the ones who eventually govern the organization, make the decisions, are voting members, and they follow one country, one vote rule. So this means that the organization is exposed to three types of pressures, right? First of all, as Jeremy explains, members do not pay the same amount of money, and rich countries are the ones who actually pay most of the funding. And as a result of which, the organization is more vulnerable to pressure from rich countries. But in addition to that, because it's a one country, one vote rule, the organization is also sensitive and vulnerable to a majority of countries when they have a coalition, and it does happen that the majority of countries at the WHO are poor, right? In addition to that, the WHO does have its own organizational mission and organizational values that come out of basically public health considerations, right? The constitution of the WHO suggests that the mission of the organization is the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. So when the WHO makes decisions, in some way it is obligated to this vision, right? Now, over the years, there are necessary, inevitable clashes between these three considerations or pressures, right? Poor countries want one thing, rich countries want something else, or rich countries want one thing that is not in alliance with the mission of the organization, and so on. So in the book that I wrote, the World Health Organization Between North and South, I exactly try to look historically and see how the WHO deals with these kind of pressures, right? In the 1970s, there was a moment in which developing countries under the Group of 77 made a lot of demands, and the WHO had to figure out how to address that. In the 1990s, with the rise of neoliberal sentiments, the US and other rich countries made also demands for reforms and so on. And what I found is that the WHO was able to somehow address the expectations that were voiced, but in a way that didn't necessarily lead to a conflict. So in the 1970s, the WHO addressed the demands of the poor countries without getting rich countries super upset. And in the 1990s, rich countries asked for reforms, and the WHO was able to do that without necessarily completely compromising or diminishing its values. And the way that I explain it, and I will be very brief, is by a strategy that I refer to as strategic compliance, which is in some way addressing the demands, attending to the expectations, but in a manipulated, reinterpreted way that allows for the WHO to also address or at least pacify the ones who are opposed to that policy. So we'll give very short example. With the rise of neoliberal sentiments in the 80s and the 90s, there was a call by the Reagan administration and other administrations to focus mostly on economic reforms in economic terms and deprioritize in some way a lot of other considerations. So the WHO was very much in the defense because health was no longer a priority in that context. So Director General Brundtland at the time, instead of accepting in some way the diminishing role of the World Health Organization, in some way created a new vision for the organization, which she referred to as health in economic terms. And in that context, she accepted the logic of economic reductionism by suggesting the WHO does have to follow the economic terms and the economic logic, but she recruited Jeffrey Sachs and others to suggest that investment in health is one of the most effective ways to bring about economic development. So she was able to, on the one hand, submit to the new multilateral logic of economic reforms, while at the same time maintaining the important role of the WHO. That would be one example. Now, in regard to what's going on today, the clash between Trump and the World Health Organization in the substantive level was very much about a travel ban. And he criticized the WHO for not accepting the logic of travel ban and accused the WHO for submitting to Chinese interests. Now, we have to remember in this context that travel ban as well as trade restrictions are policies that the WHO is very reluctant to endorse. The WHO was reluctant to endorse it in the context of COVID-19. The WHO also was against it in the context of Ebola in West Africa. And the reason is political rather than only in regard to public health, because the WHO does not have direct access to information in regard to health conditions in individual countries. So in order to be able to monitor and follow potential pandemics, the WHO requires the cooperation of countries. And the WHO bureaucracy is very concerned that if countries knew that if they report on new viruses, for example, if this would immediately lead to travel bans and trade restrictions, this would be a major disincentive for countries to report to the WHO about what they find. So to a certain extent, again, putting public health considerations aside, it's a political consideration of finding a way to not provide disincentive to countries to report and provide the WHO the information that the WHO needs. So this doesn't really follow under strategic adaptation because there are no clashes between different expectations. There are clashes between the WHO and the need of the WHO to cooperate. I suspect that once later on when, especially maybe between the US and China, when policies have to be developed in response to the lessons of COVID-19, this is where the WHO will have to find a strategic way of addressing conflicting interests of different countries.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I think this is really important because as we think about, you know, on two fronts. One, you know, there's a lot of conversation around travel bans, right? And I don't think we've got any evidence that actually they've worked particularly well, right? We wouldn't see the kind of, you know, outbreak we do in a variety of countries if travel bans were particularly effective. But then, as you say, the whole point here is we're in a pandemic in which you have to somehow secure international cooperation. And I do think that, as you say, this consideration of not even just what's the public health telling us, which I think does back the WHO on that front, but also what does it look like to actually secure international cooperation, and how little of that is going to happen if there's a race to close up and solve problems that way. We've seen historically that that's not turned out particularly well. So I think that it's an important thing for people to kind of take into consideration as they're thinking about this. So I want to turn for a minute then to kind of talk a little bit more about the politics here. President Trump's called the WHO China-centric. So let's talk about that, right? It's a clear play in part to U.S. domestic politics, but it's also a really fascinating construction, right? Because I, as somebody that's watched the WHO for a while, I've often heard the reverse critique, right? That the WHO is far too U.S.-centric, or I've heard people say the WHO is far too Gates Foundation-centric, right? So talk to us about that, and let me start with you, Nitzan, here. I don't want to ask you to be a mind reader, right? But how do you think the Secretariat's approaching its interactions with China in January and February? What factors were they weighing, given what you know? And what are the political calculations that they were making at that moment, do you think? We will recognize that we could invite on WHO colleagues to tell us the right answer at some point in the future, but in the middle of a pandemic, I guess we have to hope that we have a sense. So, but talk to us about this. What's your take on how they're interacting with China?
Okay, so the starting point is that, as we talked about, the WHO is dependent on member states, and it is particularly dependent on rich countries. And the financial dependency on rich countries, as Jeremy mentioned before, has actually increased over time. And it increased over time because of institutional changes that the US has introduced, right? One very important institutional change that really increased the dependency of the WHO on contributing countries is the shift, exactly as Jeremy said, from assessed, that is mandatory contributions, to voluntary funds, right? So in the past, most of the budget of the WHO was something that countries had to pay just to become members or maintain their membership, whereas today most of the funding is voluntary, which means that the WHO has to convince countries to give them the money. Another shift that Jeremy also mentioned is the fact that today, in addition to the World Health Organization, there are a lot of other international organizations that deal with health, and they basically compete for funding, right? So funding that goes to the Global Fund doesn't go to the WHO. So in this context, again, the WHO is even more dependent on the goodwill of countries than in the past. Now, we seem to be in the middle of a potential hegemonic struggle, right? In which the US, especially under the Trump administration, is a less reliable member of the WHO, whereas it also seems to be that China is increasing its interest and its investment in multilateral organizations, right? So in this context, it's not entirely unreasonable for the WHO to approach China, to be friendly to China, to listen to China, right? This is very different from being China-centric, but we can see why the WHO would invest in that relationship. Now, I do want to say something about what the implications are, because as I mentioned before, people seem to be fascinated by the US WHO conflict right now, partly because of what it means regarding China. And in some way, the question is China-centric WHO good news or bad news, right? And in this context, I think it's important to remember that China has been, for many years now, criticized for exactly not being a multilateral player, criticized for exactly channeling all of its investment and funding to bilateral channels, right? And now we see a shift in the political game, maybe, of China with greater interest in multilateral organizations. Now, a China-centric criticism is based on the expectation that the international organizations would be in some way a tool of China, which some people might frown upon. But people like me who think that international organizations actually have a way to tame in some way the influence of member states might think that China being more involved in multilateral organizations is not necessarily alarming news, but a way to understand anew the political dynamics of the WHO without suggesting that, you know, the hegemony is completely shifting here.
So Jeremy, coming over to you on this, I think, you know, China, you know, some are saying, you know, I've heard the term several times here in DC, right? Undue influence, right? That China has an undue influence. And the result was that somehow Dr. Tedros and colleagues were just going along with the information that China was providing rather than pushing them to be more transparent. And in the end, that somehow enabled a cover up until it was too late. What's your take on the situation? Is there merit in that analysis? And what pieces do you think are really missing from that narrative?
Well, I think it's important, as Nitzan pointed out, to think about what sort of leverage WHO actually has over member states. You know, it can't sanction states, it can't threaten to invade states, it can't throw states in some sort of country jail if they violate their obligations under the international health regulations or any other sorts of agreements that exist with the WHO. And so it really doesn't, you know, its only real power is to try to name and shame states, to try to call them out saying, you have not lived up to your obligations, or we don't believe you. And I think in this case, Tedros and the rest of the WHO leadership is trying to think about, okay, this outbreak seems to have started in China. We need this information. What is likely to get us more information that we can use to act on? Is it going to be shaming China, calling them out and publicly chastising them? Or is it trying to build more of a cooperative relationship? And I think they decided to go with the latter, just based on the fact that they thought that would be more likely to get some compliance and to encourage China to, as Nisa pointed out, to bring China into the fold, to get them to be a part of this sort of process. Now, whether or not that was going to be, that was the right decision is something that we probably won't know the actual answer to for a long time. But this is where that intersection between health and politics becomes so incredibly clear, because we can never say that, oh, health should be apolitical, or health is not something that you know, we should get the politics out of health or out of public health. That's impossible. All of these sorts of outbreaks, health is inevitably enmeshed in a larger political, economic, and social context. And so we need to recognize that. And WHO needs to recognize that it does have a limited amount of leverage in this space. And so while it's not perfect, what leverage WHO has, are member states willing to give WHO more power? Are they willing to give it the power to just go in and run roughshod over national governments and say, no, we don't believe you have to give us all of these raw data, and then we're going to do this sort of analysis? You know, that seems unlikely that states are willing to give an organization like the WHO that level of control. And so it's necessarily a balancing act, and it's trying to balance these public health demands with the diplomatic demands that an organization like WHO is trying to deal with. And so even when we can criticize some of the outcomes that we see, the alternatives, I don't know that countries are actually going to go for, or if they actually started to think through what the potential consequences would be, I don't think that they're going to be as excited. And we've already started to see in some of the reporting that came out in Foreign Policy this morning, talking about how part of this leverage that the United States was now trying to exercise over the WHO had to do with with allowing Taiwan into things like the World Health Assembly and these sorts of things. Talk about the geopolitics involved in this. I mean, that obviously is going to be a much huger issue and goes way beyond what's going on with COVID-19, and just reinforces the fact that this goes beyond just the health issues and goes into the politics, and is going to make, in a lot of ways, going to make these sorts of questions even that much more difficult to try to resolve. Because now, if we're trying to deal with the relationship between the PRC and Taiwan, in addition to these other sorts of relationships, it's probably going to make the appetite for reform, or the willingness of countries to try to champion some of these sorts of efforts probably goes down, because they're not going to want to get caught up in some of these other geopolitical battles that will emerge.
It struck me today as I was looking at various news feeds. Two side by side headlines. One was Trump administration pushes WHO, and on the other hand, New York Times front page saying that the reporting of deaths in the United States is massively undercounting the number of deaths. And so it's actually very interesting, right? Because there are these kind of broad questions of how can the WHO get information, and how do we sort out this challenge of what's just unknown, right? And therefore nobody knows it. And amidst epidemics, it's very hard to know, versus what's being hidden for political purposes, which is certainly not to decry, not to say that that doesn't happen all the time, right? That, as you point out, this is hugely political, and we're seeing the implications of that. And so it really does give leaders the impetus to hide information. And so how does WHO try to mobilize what kind of tools? I think it's going to be very interesting as we think about the kind of certain conversation that's going to come next about reforming the IHRs. What will member states be up for and not? If we have time, I'll get to that. But I want to invite everybody to go ahead and put questions into the chat box. We'll open it up to questions in just a few minutes. I've got a few more, and then we'll start reading some of them. Please let us know who you are, etc. So Nitzan, coming back to you for a minute, can you talk to us a little bit more about how do member states, whether it's China or the United States, what does it look like to exercise influence? Because I think, we kind of imagine in the macro political conversation that somehow the WHO is monolithic and that mostly what it's doing is COVID, and maybe right now that is a little bit true. But I think it's a pretty sprawling organization and really interesting. So when we think about undue influence, what does influence actually mean at the WHO? What's happening? How are countries exercising it?
So this is a really important question, especially in this context, because both Jeremy and I have very much emphasized the role of potential funding as a source of influence. But in a way, this is vulgar influence, right? And there are all these other ways, more mundane maybe, and maybe not related completely or directly to the funding of the WHO, in which countries can exert influence. So one important thing is actually being present, right? I mean, you have the World Health Assemblies and you have a lot of agencies and committees and so on. And countries have influence if they show up. And in that regard, the US and which countries again have influence or greater influence over countries that don't have the resources to send delegates or don't have the resources to send enough delegates, right? So the number of delegates really matters, whether the same delegates show up to meeting after meeting. So to sustain the institutional memory really matters, whether they are likely to speak really matters, whether they are informed about the debates really matters. In all of these contexts, the US and other rich countries have much greater influence than poor countries, right? It's also known by research that even though there are a number of formal languages at the WHO, there is advantage, Chinese is one of them, there is advantage to English-speaking countries in this context, right? So in this mundane, day-to-day, face-to-face interactions, the US is still very influential. At the same time, and this is something that Jeremy hinted at, you need to build on coalitions as well. You need allies, right? You need people to vote with you or countries to vote with you. And in this context, the geopolitical order is really important, because if the US is losing allies now, whereas China is building a lot of bilateral ties through foreign aid and other means, it is possible that through voting, rather than only through funding, the US is losing in some way its influence, and China or other countries might be more influential than they used to. So there are different strategies by which influence is practiced rather than only, being abstract.
And to either of you, I mean, are there examples where countries have tried this similar strategy of pulling funding, or even kind of, there's been a lot of talk that the U.S. might divert funding that it would have otherwise given to WHO and put it into something else to create their own WHO. So has there been a history of countries trying this in the past, and what happened?
Jeremy, I mean, we both have the same answer probably.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is actually the whole effort in the late 70s and the early 1980s with Health for All by 2000, and this idea that we were going to promote this idea of primary health care, and this was going to be something that was was this basic standard for everyone around the world. And then in the early 1980s, as you see the rise of folks like Thatcher and Reagan and Helmut Kohl, and the rise of conservative political movements in some of the wealthy countries, that there's this scaling back and saying like, no, actually we're going to move this into something more selective, and we're going to change into to other sorts of things. And that's also when you start to see some of the real changes in how the funding structures worked within WHO writ large, and these efforts by the wealthy countries that are providing a lot of the donor funding to direct it specifically to projects that they themselves are determining, as opposed to just giving it to the WHO's general organizational budget, where it could then make those sorts of determinations. And that's something that now 40 years on is still having an effect on what the WHO is able to do. And in addition to the actual direct budgetary effects and those sorts of consequences, I think it also has made the organization perhaps a bit gun shy about how ambitious it wants to be in the scope and the scale of the sorts of things that it promotes.
So if I can add to that, I mean, just to continue the historical trajectory, there were definitely initiatives, especially in the 2000s, in some way in response to the AIDS crisis, in which countries basically took responsibilities that would have traditionally belonged to the WHO and create competing international organizations, public-private partnerships, and others. Jeremy already mentioned the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. There's the MMV, Gavi, and so on. And of course, there are also unilateral attempts, right? I mean, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, is a unilateral way to channel money to fight AIDS that doesn't go completely through multilateral channels. So there are definitely examples of successful in some way or sustainable international organizations that now compete with the WHO over global health initiatives. And it's exactly one of the reasons that the WHO is more vulnerable to its member states, right? Because the member states, even if they care about a particular project, they can say we shouldn't give it to the WHO, which is not efficient enough or too politicized, and we should give it to other organizations that are governed differently.
And it's so interesting, though, then to watch, you know, despite all of that infrastructure building and all of that that's gone on, right, in the 2000s, we're now in the middle of COVID and WHO is in the center, right? It's really interesting. You would have thought that you would have seen a very different context, and to some degree you are. I think the launch of the new accelerator shows a bunch of new actors at play, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with that. But it is very interesting to see that the WHO is still front and center. Clearly, there's a kind of coordination mechanism and frankly a political mechanism, I think, that the WHO plays that's kind of irreplaceable. That it's not actually, nobody else can do so credibly.
One could also argue that it's the other way around, that it's surprising that the WHO is present only in the midst of such global pandemics, and what is the politics behind the fact that the competing international organizations are dealing with issues such as malaria and tuberculosis and AIDS and vaccinations, but not with global pandemics, and how that's going to change over time in the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I want to open it up now to we've gotten a series of great questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start at the top here. Oyewele Tomare from Nigeria has kicked us off here and has a number of different questions. And one, I mean, he kind of points out, right, that many countries, especially in Africa, depend a lot on the WHO, and therefore weakening the body has actually a very important, potentially crippling kind of effect there, right? So I wonder, kind of two questions coming out of what he's asking. Maybe I'll just ask the first one, which is, what is the relationship between WHO and low and middle income countries that's different? And are there ways in which the WHO could play a different role with low and middle income countries that might actually support greater capacity? Or is the kind of narrative of dependency something that you both worry about?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, in part because, you know, WHO itself, because it doesn't have a lot of resources, because it doesn't actually have as huge of a bureaucracy as people might envision, it's not like it can go impose policies on countries. It can't tell countries you should do X, Y, and Z, but it has these unique resources to be able to bring together different people with different sorts of experiences to act as this forum for sharing information, sharing best practices, and working through some of these sorts of more technical sorts of issues on health. And those are the sorts of things that are going to fly underneath the radar and are not really going to be super public, but can be really valuable. And this is actually one of the areas in which a lot of these sorts of questions about the funding for the WHO from the United States actually become really crucial, because those are the sorts of things that are likely to get lost in the shuffle. If funding gets is diverted away from WHO, those are the sorts of programs that are likely to see their funding significantly reduced or dry up. And that's also an area in which a country like China could easily come in and play a really significant leadership role. If you have the United States kind of abdicating its leadership role within global health, there's a vacuum there, and China could easily come in and play this. So ironically enough, as the time that you're decrying China having too much influence in the World Health Organization, this actually could facilitate China having more of an influence within the World Health Organization, because we know that China has a really strong and long-standing medical diplomacy program with a number of sub-Saharan African states. And so there are some of those sorts of efforts. And it gets back to this question about how much agency do you actually give to the organization. If you want to try to remove this, move this away from more of a dependency type relationship, you have to give the organization the ability, the flexibility in its budget to be able to do that, so that countries aren't going to be solely dependent upon the generosity of a major patron, if you will, in order to implement these sorts of programs. But this sort of technical and policy efforts for the low and middle income countries are not the sorts of things that are likely to receive a lot of attention from the donor states. This is not something that they tend to put their money towards. They tend to put their money towards, the polio eradication initiatives and these sorts of big campaigns. But these more, for lack of a better term, mundane sorts of programs are actually at the backbone of being able to achieve that goal of trying to help people to attain the highest possible standard of health.
Nitsan, I want to come to you on a next question, which is Pratik Sharma writes in asking, WHO DG Gro Brundtland called out China during the SARS outbreak, and so what has changed now that DG Tedros doesn't feel that naming and shaming approach would be as effective? Do you see this as a shift, and if so, how do you explain it?
So in some way, we don't know the reality or the facts that each one of these director generals were confronting, right? So we cannot necessarily assume that the same situation on the ground led Director General Brundtland to react in one way, whereas Dr. Tedros to react in a different way. It is possible that China was more collaborative this time rather than last time, partly possibly exactly because of the experience of SARS. But even if assuming for the sake of hypothetical argument that in the 2000s, the World Health Organization was more willing to be critical of China than today, it very much responds to the situation on the ground that we talked about in some way already, in which the WHO is in a vulnerable position in general. And it's in a vulnerable position in general because it is, starved in some way. It is competing with other international organizations. It does have to ask for money from international, for philanthropies and member states and so on. And in this context, China being the new, the new target or potentially new target to get funding from and support from, it is not entirely surprising in some way.
And so I want to go, Namrata Ganeri from Mumbai had written in asking, what do you think the changing relationship between China and the WHO in the last few months, how do you all think it will play out in the next few years with the WHO withdrawing? Now, I don't know what, I think that Jeremy, you made the point that it's not potentially not that surprising. And this is potentially not actually about withdrawal and more about gaining leverage, right? So part of what it's unknown exactly what the strategic interaction will be, but do you think that WHO is looking to, that China is looking to leverage new kinds of leadership, and how do you both think this will play out in this context of the US and and China around the WHO? What do you think?
So
Do you want to take that first? Go ahead, Nitzan.
So there are three dimensions here, I think. One is situational, one institutional, and one is structural or geopolitical. Situationally, it very much depends on the Trump administration and whether or not what the Trump administration is going to do and what the next administration, whenever that arrives, will do, right? A lot of these decisions, especially the funding decision, is reversible, right? So there could be momentary or temporal decisions that could be easily reversed in a way that we wouldn't notice it in a few years. Now, if this lasts for longer, the situational circumstances might lead to larger institutional changes at WHO. Some programs will have to be killed, right? Some issues will have to be deprioritized. And if in that context, China or other countries kind of like fill in the void and fund other programs or other priorities or other issues, then what is situational could lead to institutional changes that are much less easy to reverse. All of this is in a context of unstable geopolitical order, right? I mean, we don't entirely know what the US position is going to be economically in the next few years. We don't know what the goals and the economic position of China is going to be. In this context, COVID-19 could be a turning point, right? We saw some kind of a trajectory in which China maybe is rising, US maybe not. COVID-19 is going to have major economic consequences, both to China and to the US and the rest of the world. And where we end up by the end of it is going to very much influence a lot of things, including the relative influence of countries in international organizations, obviously.
So Josh Busby wants to ask a bit from the University of Texas. Can the WHO's new access initiative, the accelerator that I mentioned earlier, can it succeed without US involvement and frankly without Chinese involvement, right? So this has been was announced by the WHO. We understand that there's kind of strong EU leadership behind it. And, importantly, we had several African heads of state that were on the phone, joining that. But really notable that neither China nor the United States were represented in it. And in fact, the United States sent a rather terse press release about why they weren't joining. So Jeremy, maybe over to you. What do you think? Is there the prospect of this accelerator working in this current context if the United States and China decide to sit it out?
In some respects, it could actually be a good thing just because it takes these two very polarizing actors within this organization and kind of removes them a little bit. And a lot of times when we see these sorts of reforms happening within international organizations, we look to those middle powers, those those quote unquote good international citizens to really help lead the way. And part of the reason that they're able to do that is because they're not seen as quite as polarizing or quite as partisan. So in some respects, if we do have significant leadership coming from the EU, coming from African heads of state, and coming from those sorts of countries, that might give it a little bit of room to maneuver in which it can avoid some of the more extreme debates that are taking place within the WHO. So part of me really wishes that either or both countries were a part of it, but in some respects, this might allow it to avoid getting caught up in all these other sorts of debates right now. Now, I could be proven completely wrong in a short period of time, but that's my one hope, or at least my one glimmer of hope, is that maybe it will receive a little less media attention, and maybe that lack of media attention will actually allow it to focus more on the products and the results that can come from it.
So Birsu Matagili asks, is there an argument for setting up a review commission right now before the end of the pandemic? Now, the WHO has already said, right, that after every major incident, there's a variety of review commissions. I think there were, at least 4 or maybe 5 that were set up following Ebola. So clearly this is coming, but is there an argument to setting it up now? Or is there kind of this, evaluation and reform fatigue that actually says you don't do this now and you certainly don't do it in the middle of a pandemic? What do you all think, looking at kind of the history of what has mattered? What do you think about setting up something now versus later? To either of you. Go for it, Jeremy.
Yeah, sure. I think that doing some sort of review is obviously going to be important. As you pointed out, Matt, that this is something that we have a long history of. I'm a little skeptical about setting it up right now, in part just because it's hard to even know the broad parameters of what you'd want to investigate in the midst of trying to figure out what's going on. So actually just having a good idea of the mandate for an investigative commission is a little bit difficult. But even more than having some sort of investigation is what sort of appetite is there going to be to act on any sorts of recommendations coming out of these sorts of issues. With the 4 or 5 commissions that we got coming out in the aftermath of Ebola, that was great. But then by the time everything was done, those countries that might provide some leadership in helping to move some of these reforms forward were stepping away or were fatigued or had moved on to the other sorts of issues. So it's not even so much should we have an investigation, it's how do we make sure we do something with that investigation so it doesn't just end up on the bookshelves collecting dust in the aftermath of it.
As a comparative historical sociologist, I appreciate both contemporary research and historical perspective. So in that context, I think that it's very important and would be very good to start, in a way, fact-finding right now, right? Because some information would disappear over time. So to start collecting the information right now, I think would be very advisable. In regard to the kind of recommendations that Jeremy is talking about, I agree that that in some way could wait until we actually know what the outcome was. So in some way, a division of labor between what you are expected to do now and what you expect to do later would be useful, maybe.
So as we approach the end of our time together, I'm just going to give each of you a last word. In particular, as we think about this question of, there are already calls for reforms, there are already calls for, for shifts, and it ranges from everything of what I would call constructive, right? Reform, demands that how do we actually finance WHO so that they can do more of what we're talking about, to some very disabling proposals out there, right? So if you all look ahead, what do you see? Sorry for the request to be super brief, but what's your kind of short couple sentences about where you see this going, if you were to look back and then look ahead in the next couple of years for WHO? So maybe over to Nitzan to start and Jeremy to close.
So I think that the conclusion of this conversation, at least, is that on the one hand, we should not be critical of the WHO or other organizations, international organizations. The WHO makes mistakes. It made a lot of mistakes with Ebola. It's probably making mistakes right now with COVID-19. But to a certain extent, we might want to thank President Trump, because by demonizing to a certain extent the WHO, it reminded all of us that this is an essential organization, and rather than killing it or starving it, what we really want, to go back to the original question about low and middle income countries and the WHO support of them, what we really want is an international organization that is responsible for public health issues at the global level, and that is receptive not only to the needs and interests of the countries with money, but also the needs and interest to other member states. I think this is really important.
Jeremy, last word on the future?
Oh, goodness. I think the important thing to really take away from this is that even with the successes and failures of the World Health Organization in dealing with COVID-19 and these other sorts of outbreaks, the public health is still fundamentally a national and a subnational responsibility. And that the WHO is trying to operate in an environment where it's incredibly constrained, And I think that any of these efforts to try to reform or change the WHO, countries need to be willing to think about what sorts of trade-offs they're willing to make. And there, as Nissan said, there's definitely room to criticize WHO for how it's responded, but that doesn't mean that we need to completely hobble it, because if we didn't have a WHO, we'd need to create a WHO. So the question is it's more about how do we create a better WHO, a more responsive WHO that can really live up to its constitutional mandate.
So with that, let me just say that I apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get to, but also we have a plan. So our plan is we're going to try to answer as many as we can on Twitter. So we'll share these both with our panelists, but also with everybody who is on this call, and perhaps we can kind of continue to engage in this. I want to thank the Monkey Cage and thank Brown University and Watson Institute and folks at the O'Neill Institute and others for helping put this together. We're hoping this is the first in a series of conversations, but it's certainly not the last conversation on the World Health Organization. And so, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. as folks down the road seem to be hatching a variety of different plans for the WHO. And I think one of the core questions to me that's going to continue is, what is the mission of the WHO? How does it actually sufficiently resourced to be able to do that? And then how do we take account of the real political job that the WHO has been given? Because it's a complex job. It's actually one of, I would argue, the most complex political tasks that exists out there. And it's only highlighted most strongly in the middle of this pandemic. But frankly, every day, this is what's happening. I work a lot on HIV, and I watch the way in which the WHO navigates the demands of various countries alongside the demands of industry, alongside the demands of the Gates Foundation and others every single day. And so I think paying attention to those political issues is something we can't avoid. So thank you both for being here and for joining us for this excellent conversation. We thank everybody else for joining as well, and we'll share out the information and the recording of the video. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, Matthew.